Kay, perhaps I could just start with a couple of questions. And the one that's on everybody's mind at the moment is, guess what? Ireland and the Irish border. And just before I ask you for your take on this, a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is, I'm not sure what's really meant by regulatory alignment, because I'm assuming that's less than equivalence. But if it's the same as equivalence, then no doubt Northern Ireland would be wanting access rights on the basis of equivalence. Would it be just access rights to let's say, Ireland, or would it be access rights to the EU? And then how would the UK mainland react to that? Would they start setting up subsidiaries in Northern Ireland? So there's a lot of sort of unanswered questions there. And I think my last one, so I'm piling them up on you a bit, but my last one is really, how do you stop a soft border becoming a leaky border? In the sense that, will a number of migrant camps move from France and set up in Ireland suddenly because they see that there's a leaky border there that they might be able to cross? So there's a lot of bits and pieces there, but they're really prompters. You don't have to answer all of them, I promise you.
Okay, so given that I am Welsh, I have a Celtic background. I have a lot of sympathy for my colleagues, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. The real issue, though, about this is that this has been known from the very outset. It was one of the biggest campaign issues in the referendum. We always knew this was a major problem, and how do you make sure that you don't interfere with the peace process in Northern Ireland and interfere with the Good Friday Agreement that took such a long time to get in place? How do you do all of that and make sure that you have no physical border because you don't want to return to days of old? We've had a long time to think about it. And in fairness to the EU27, they've always seen Brexit as being a UK instigated move, and it's therefore up to the UK to come up with the solutions. So there are no solutions forthcoming from the EU27 on anything. This is purely about the process, the mechanics of how we leave, and what eventually, I hope, will move on to a new free trade deal discussion. But we're not even there yet. We're only at the mechanics of how we leave. And they're relying solely on the UK to actually come up with the proposals that they can then say yes or no to, or indeed then change slightly in order to make them something that they are accepting. The really great political move that the EU27 made earlier this week was to say to Ireland, you effectively have a veto. If the deal's not good enough for you, in terms of that border, we will allow you to dictate the EU27's position. That was a stroke of genius in terms of politics, because suddenly you've given a tiny minnow of a country all of this power and influence because it's directly affecting them. The UK government didn't see it coming, by all accounts. They had no idea that all of a sudden the TASOC was going to be in charge of whether or not sufficient progress has been made or not. And that, I think, is maybe a small example of the bigger issues we're facing, where anticipating the move of the other side should be something we do all the time. And we seem to be taken by surprise. The one that got me yesterday, however, was that whilst Mrs. May was at lunch, there was a press conference going on with her DUP partners. I am still trying to get to the bottom of why that discussion didn't take place before she had her lunch. So I'm waiting for my briefing. I'm hoping it's coming soon. Certainly wasn't in my briefings this morning that I received. But it does seem we're not anticipating things as we maybe should, given that the UK is expected to come up with all of the solutions and that they're responding and reacting to it. And Article 50, after all, is a process. It was set in the treaties and was written, indeed, by a British civil servant. So it was our process that we're now following. So I am sometimes a little confused, but maybe I've been in Brussels a little too long and maybe think a little more like the Brussels elite than I do my own government.
Can I tease you along on that debate a bit? Because my own personal view has been that our negotiating stance has been pretty shabby. There's a lot of shouty stuff, a lot of grandstanding. It lacks sophistication. There's certainly not a statesman there acting on behalf of the UK. You don't have to comment on that. You may not want to. But what you said earlier was indicating that perhaps we're just not on the ball enough.
I think having negotiated out in Brussels for the last nearly 9 years, there is a very definite way in which the EU operates and the way the EU actually takes its position and then shapes it and comes to a compromise. The word compromise in Brussels means you get a deal done. It's not a bad word. It's not about losing and giving something up. It's about how you find the deal that suits most of the people most of the time. And so the mindset is very, very different in the way that you come to consensus out in Brussels. And I think the frustration for me is watching people who haven't grasped that way of dealing with things, trying to do it in what they describe as the Anglo-Saxon way. Just because it makes sense doesn't mean to say that's the way you're going to do it. And the Brussels way sometimes is not as obvious as the way I get accused. As a Celt, I get very upset with the term Anglo-Saxon because I'm not one. But actually, it's the way, it's the loose way that my colleagues in continental Europe refer to the English-speaking nations within the EU. And so they also group the US into that, and I don't know many of my US colleagues who think of themselves as Anglo-Saxons either. So, but it loosely is those of us who use English as our first language and have a very free market orientation. And they group us together in that way. But that mindset is very different to the one that Brussels operates. So I wouldn't say it's shabby in terms of the way that we're actually approaching this. We're just approaching it with a very British outlook. And we're looking at it from the UK's perspective rather than from the perspective of the other side. And any of you in this room who've done negotiations know you should know the other side better than you know yourself. And I think there needs to be a little more time spent actually studying what it is that the other side are looking for. And on the exit, which is this Article 50 negotiation, it's purely about how the terms that we negotiate to leave. The new deal, the new relationship going forwards is subject to a completely different legal basis and will not be started until the green light is given on this one. And that was clear from the outset. We just didn't accept it for nearly a year. But actually, everyone else knew that that was the case. But the EU27, when people say they're all unified, they've got one position, well, yes, they're unified because their position was to give the mandate to negotiate Brexit, as in the Article 50 bit of this, to one person, and they agreed the mandate up front back in July. But that's a very, very brief mandate. It's 3 points. And it's been delegated. They've given it to Michel Barnier, who's a very talented negotiator, very talented politician, former commissioner responsible for financial services. Some of you probably already came across him. He is formidable when he gets going. But he has had that delegated to him. So people are united because they don't care. They've given him the job. He's getting on with it. They're getting on with everything else. They're planning the future post-Brexit. They're talking about the future of the EMU. They're talking about the future of their financial regulation. They're talking about the bigger picture issues once the UK has gone. And so the unity is because they've delegated it. Wait until they start talking about a free trade deal and then watch the unity disappear.